The call came just as I was placing the final signature on the papers that would have transferred the apartment into my son's name, a quiet gift I had planned for months. But before the pen even left the page, his voice erupted through the phone, telling me not to come to dinner because his wife did not want me there. And in that single moment, every humiliation I had swallowed for years settled in my chest like a stone, while I listened to my own child speak to me as if I were a burden he needed to discard. Yet he had no idea what I was about to do next as I slowly closed the folder, reached for my lawyer's number, and let a different kind of calm take over. The kind that comes when a man finally understands he has been betrayed not once but repeatedly by the very people he loved the most. And as I stood there hearing my son breathe angrily on the other end of the line, I made a decision that would turn their world upside down, a decision that would strip away every entitlement they had taken for granted. And if the audience listens closely, they will feel the exact moment the story shifts from hurt to power, as I set in motion a chain of events that neither my son nor his wife ever saw coming, because by the next morning the apartment they expected to own was no longer theirs, and the life they thought they controlled was slipping through their fingers. And this is only the beginning of a revenge that unfolds in ways far more satisfying than they ever imagined. My name is Leonard Grant. I am 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades designing bridges across America. When my wife Evelyn passed away 18 months ago, the house we built together suddenly felt too large, too quiet, and far too empty. That Sunday morning began with something I had not felt in a long time: hope. Brian had called the night before, his voice carrying an unusual warmth. "Dad, we're having dinner tomorrow. Vanessa wants you to come." Those words played in my mind like a melody I had forgotten. 3 months. It had been 3 months since I last sat at their table. 3 months since I held my granddaughter Lily. 3 months since I felt like I still belonged to a family. I told myself not to read too much into the invitation. But hope is stubborn, especially when loneliness has worn you down. I woke early and ironed my best shirt. The blue one Evelyn always said matched my eyes. I polished my shoes until they gleamed. At the florist on Maple Street, I picked yellow roses for Vanessa and a small bouquet of daisies for Lily. The clerk smiled as she wrapped them. "Special occasion?" she asked. I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "Family dinner," I said. The word tasted good in my mouth. Back home, I checked the clock every few minutes. The dinner was not until 6, but I wanted to arrive early. I wanted to help set the table, to be useful, to show them I was still capable of contributing. The apartment felt different that morning, less like a waiting room and more like a home again. Then the phone rang. Brian's voice came through strained and uncomfortable. "Dad, listen, about tonight." He paused, and in that pause I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "Don't come. Vanessa says it's not a good time." I gripped the receiver tighter. "Not a good time? But you invited me yesterday. I bought flowers. I ironed my—" In the background, Vanessa's voice sliced through like a cold blade. "Just tell him to stop calling. We don't need him here." Brian did not defend me. He did not argue. He simply exhaled, the sound of a man who had surrendered long ago. "I'm sorry, Dad. Maybe next month." The line went dead. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the yellow roses still in my hand, their petals bright against the gray afternoon light. The daisies for Lily sat on the counter, wrapped in pink paper she would never see. I placed the flowers in the sink and watched them slowly wilt against the stainless steel. Something inside me wilted with them. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had known since Evelyn's funeral. I sank into my chair by the window and stared at the street below without seeing it. Vanessa's words echoed. "Stop calling. Don't need him. Not a good time." Each phrase was a small hammer striking the same bruise. And then Evelyn's voice came to me, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper. 6 weeks before she died, when the cancer had stolen most of her strength but none of her clarity, she had gripped my hand and whispered, "Be careful with Vanessa. She looks at our apartment like a predator looks at prey. Promise me you'll protect yourself." I had dismissed it then. Evelyn was tired, I told myself. The medication made her anxious. Vanessa was difficult, yes, but she was still family. I kissed my wife's forehead and promised her everything would be fine. Now, sitting alone in the apartment Evelyn had worried about, I understood. She had seen what I refused to see. She had known what I could not accept. My eyes drifted to the desk in the corner. There, half buried under bills and old newspapers, sat a cream-colored envelope with Evelyn's handwriting on the front. I had found it weeks ago while sorting her belongings but never opened it. I assumed it was an old love letter, something too painful to read. I was not ready to face more grief. So I left it there, sealed and waiting. Tonight, I could not bring myself to open it either. Instead, I turned my attention to the documents beside it. The apartment transfer papers. I had spent weeks preparing them, ready to gift the property to Brian so he would always have security. I had planned to sign them after dinner, as a gesture of love and trust. I picked up the folder and stared at my son's name typed neatly on the first page. Brian Grant, beneficiary. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears I refused to let fall. Slowly, deliberately, I closed the folder. Then I placed it in the drawer and locked it. Evelyn was right about her, I whispered to the empty room, and it's time I started listening. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in the darkness staring at the ceiling, replaying Vanessa's words until they carved themselves into my memory. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. Grief can cloud a man's judgment. Betrayal has a way of clearing it. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Evelyn and I had shared 41 years of breakfasts. The apartment surrounded me with echoes of her presence. The curtains she had chosen, the photographs she had arranged on the walls, the scratch on the floor from when we moved in our first Christmas tree. Every corner held a piece of our life together. This was not just a home. It was a monument to everything we had built. $450,000. That was what the appraiser had valued it at 2 years ago. But no number could capture what it truly represented. 40 years of work, 40 years of early mornings and late nights, of calculations and deadlines, of bridges rising over rivers I would never cross again. Every beam I designed, every structure I certified, had added another brick to this foundation. Evelyn and I had saved carefully, sacrificed vacations, driven old cars until they wheezed. We did it all so Brian would inherit something solid. A foundation, I used to tell her. Our son will always have a foundation. The deed sat in my desk drawer, complete and ready. Only my signature was missing. I had planned to sign it after the dinner that never happened, to present it to Brian as a symbol of trust and love. Now the document felt less like a gift and more like a weapon I had nearly handed to my enemies. 6 months ago, I might have dismissed that thought as paranoid. But 6 months ago, something happened that I chose to forget until now. It was Lily's birthday party. The apartment was crowded with relatives and neighbors, children running through the halls, laughter filling the rooms. I stood by the window watching Lily open her presents when I heard Vanessa's voice rise above the chatter. She was speaking to her mother on the phone, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This apartment will be ours eventually," she said, scanning the living room with a slow, measuring gaze. "It's just a matter of waiting." A few guests laughed uncomfortably. Someone changed the subject, but I saw Vanessa's eyes move from the hardwood floors to the crown molding, from the view of the city to the updated kitchen. She was not joking. She was appraising. And in that moment, something cold settled in my chest and never quite left. I poured myself another cup of coffee and thought about Evelyn's final months. Even as the illness stole her strength, she spent hours at this very table, organizing documents, bank statements, property records, insurance policies. She filed and labeled and sorted with an intensity that puzzled me. "What are you doing?" I asked her one afternoon. She looked up with tired eyes. "I'm preparing everything in case something happens. You'll need to know where things are." I assumed she meant the practical matters of death. Insurance claims, pension paperwork, the business of ending a life. I kissed her forehead and told her not to worry. Now I wondered if she had meant something else entirely. Evelyn had always seen further than I could. Perhaps she was not just preparing for her death. Perhaps she was preparing for what would come after. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Ruth Callahan standing in the hallway holding a pot of soup. Ruth was 72, a retired librarian with white hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had lived across the hall for 15 years, and Evelyn had considered her a dear friend. "Thought you might need something warm," she said, stepping inside. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." I thanked her and set the pot on the stove. Ruth lingered, her expression carrying something heavier than casual concern. "Leonard," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something. Vanessa stopped by last week. She was asking questions about you." I turned to face her. "What kind of questions?" Ruth hesitated. "She wanted to know if you've been forgetful lately. If you leave the stove on, if you forget names or repeat yourself. She asked if I'd noticed any signs of confusion." The words landed like stones in still water. I understood immediately what Vanessa was doing. She was building a case, gathering witnesses, laying the groundwork to declare me incompetent. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Ruth's chin lifted with defiance. "I told her you're sharper than me on my best day. I told her you finished the crossword puzzle in ink last Tuesday and beat me at chess 3 times this month." She paused, her voice softening. "Leonard, that woman is not asking out of concern. She's hunting for something." After Ruth left, I sat alone with the silence in the soup and the weight of everything I now understood. Vanessa was not waiting for me to give her the apartment. She was preparing to take it. I picked up my phone, but I did not dial Brian's number. Instead, I scrolled through old contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Porter Law Office." "Marlene?" I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "It's Leonard Grant. I need your help. I need to protect myself from my own family." Marlene Porter's office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of place that felt solid and permanent. I had not seen her in nearly 5 years, not since Evelyn and I updated our wills. But when I called, she cleared her schedule without hesitation. "Come tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring everything." I spent that night gathering documents, property records, bank statements, letters from Brian and Vanessa, even old greeting cards I had saved. By dawn, I had filled a cardboard box with the paper trail of my life. I did not know what would matter and what would not, so I brought it all. Marlene met me at her door with a firm handshake and knowing eyes. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much suffering to waste time on pleasantries. Her specialty was elder law, a field she had practiced for over 20 years. She had helped hundreds of families navigate the painful intersection of aging and betrayal. I could tell from the way she looked at me that she recognized the weight I carried. "Sit down, Leonard," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her desk. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the canceled dinner and Vanessa's sharp words in the background. I told her about Ruth's warning and the questions about my memory. I told her about the apartment transfer documents sitting unsigned in my drawer and the cold look in Vanessa's eyes at Lily's birthday party. Marlene listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she leaned back and studied me for a long moment. "You did the right thing by calling me," she said. "What you're describing follows a pattern I've seen many times. Isolation, competency questioning, pressure to transfer assets. These are not random behaviors, they're steps." She reached for the box I had brought and began sorting through the documents. For nearly an hour, she reviewed every page while I sat in silence, watching her face for any sign of what she was finding. Finally, she stopped at a folder I did not recognize. It was from a title company, dated 2 years ago. "Leonard," she said carefully, "did you ever authorize anyone to add a name to your apartment deed?" I shook my head. "No. The deed has always been in my name alone. Evelyn's name was removed after she passed." Marlene turned the folder toward me. Inside was a request form to add Vanessa Grant to the property title. Attached was a letter claiming I had given verbal authorization for the change. The signature at the bottom of that letter was supposedly mine, except I had never written it. I had never seen it. I had never authorized anything. "The title company flagged this as suspicious," Marlene explained. "Your signature didn't match their records, and they couldn't reach you for verification. The request was denied." She paused, letting the weight of the discovery settle. "Vanessa tried to put herself on your deed 2 years ago, Leonard. She forged authorization, and she never told you." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. 2 years. For 2 years, my daughter-in-law had been scheming to take my home, and I had continued inviting her to dinner, buying gifts for her birthday, treating her like family. Marlene closed the folder and set it aside. "I need you to understand something important. We live in a one-party consent state. That means if someone is part of a conversation, they can legally record it without the other person's knowledge. She fixed me with a steady gaze. If Brian ever decides to record a conversation with his wife, that recording would be admissible in court. Remember that. I nodded, though I could not imagine my son turning against Vanessa. He had chosen her over me at every opportunity, but Marlene planted the seed anyway, and seeds have a way of growing in unexpected soil. People like Vanessa rarely strike only once, she continued. This attempted fraud tells me she's been planning for years. I'm going to investigate her background, previous addresses, financial history, any court records. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. Her tone shifted then, becoming gentler but no less urgent. Leonard, what she's doing to you, the isolation, the competency questions, the unauthorized document changes. This isn't just a difficult family situation. This is the early pattern of elder financial abuse. I've seen it destroy people. We need to act before she escalates. I left Marlene's office carrying the weight of new knowledge and the strange comfort of having someone finally believe me. That evening, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker to life and thought about Evelyn. She had tried to warn me. She had spent her final months preparing, and I had dismissed her concerns as the worries of a dying woman. My phone buzzed with a text message. Marlene's name glowed on the screen. Found something about Vanessa's past. There was an incident in 2018. A woman named Dorothy Collins, her own grandmother. Meet me tomorrow morning. This changes everything. I read the message 3 times, feeling the ground shift beneath me once again. Whatever Vanessa had done before, whatever pattern Marlene had uncovered, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The woman I had welcomed into my family was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I did not sleep that night. Marlene's message burned in my mind like a lit fuse. Dorothy Collins, Vanessa's own grandmother. The 2018 incident. Whatever happened 6 years ago, it was connected to the woman who had married my son and slowly poisoned my family from within. But answers would have to wait until morning. For now, I sat alone with the darkness and the weight of everything I did not yet understand. Sometime after midnight, my eyes drifted to the desk drawer where Evelyn's envelope still waited. The cream-colored paper seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, her handwriting as familiar as my own heartbeat. For 18 months, I had avoided opening it. The grief was too fresh, the loss too raw. I told myself I was not ready to read her final words. But tonight, something had shifted. The woman I thought I knew as my daughter-in-law was revealing herself to be a stranger, and my wife, even in death, seemed to be reaching toward me with a warning I had refused to hear. I crossed the room and retrieved the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Something solid pressed against the paper from inside. My hands trembled as I broke the seal and emptied the contents onto the desk. A handwritten letter, a small USB drive, and a folded note with 5 words written on the outside. Open only if Vanessa becomes a threat. My breath caught in my throat. Evelyn had known. Even as cancer stole her strength, even as she organized documents and prepared for the end, she had been watching, planning, protecting me from beyond the grave. I unfolded the note first. It contained a single sentence. The USB has everything you need. Give it to Marlene. Then I opened the letter. My dearest Leonard, it began, and I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. If you're reading this, I'm no longer there to protect you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry I couldn't shield you from what I knew was coming, but I've done what I could, and now you must do the rest. I read each word slowly, savoring the familiar rhythm of her thoughts. I've watched Vanessa for years. She looks at our home the way her mother Gloria looks at everything as something to consume. They measure worth in dollars and weakness in kindness. I've seen how she treats you when she thinks no one is watching. The dismissals, the eye rolls, the way she poisons Brian against you with whispered lies. She is not careless, Leonard. She is patient, and patience in a predator is the most dangerous quality of all. Evelyn's handwriting grew slightly uneven toward the middle of the page, a sign of the fatigue that had plagued her final months. But her words remained sharp and clear. I've saved evidence on this USB, copies of all our property documents, screenshots of messages I found on Brian's phone when he left it unlocked one evening, instructions for Marlene, whom I trust completely. If Vanessa has made her move, this evidence will help you fight back. The letter continued with words that would stay with me forever. Remember this, my love. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. You have spent your whole life building bridges for others. Now you must build walls for yourself. Protect yourself. Protect Lily. She is the only innocent one left in that house. At the bottom of the page, she had signed her name with the same elegant script she had used on our wedding invitation 41 years ago. I love you eternally, Evelyn. I wiped my eyes and reached for the USB drive. My old laptop hummed to life as I inserted it, and a folder appeared on the screen containing dozens of files, property records, bank statements, legal documents, and a subfolder labeled Messages. I clicked it open and felt the room tilt around me. Screenshots. Text messages between Vanessa and her mother, Gloria, dated 3 years ago. Evelyn must have photographed them from Brian's phone while he was distracted. Gloria had written, "The old woman is getting weaker. Once she's gone, only the old man remains. Easy target." Vanessa's reply appeared below. "I know, Mom. Brian doesn't suspect anything. By the time he realizes, everything will be ours." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. They had discussed my wife's death like a business opportunity. They had planned my exploitation while Evelyn was still alive, still fighting, still hoping for more time. The cruelty of it stole my breath. Another file caught my attention. A note Evelyn had typed herself, dated 1 month before she died. "Gloria Collins, watch carefully. She asks too many questions about our finances. She positioned Vanessa in this family for a reason. The daughter is the weapon, but the mother is the hand that aims it. Gloria, the true architect." Vanessa was merely following orders from a woman who had been scheming long before my son ever proposed. I returned to Evelyn's letter, noticing for the first time a postscript written at the very bottom of the page, almost hidden in the fold. "P.S. Ask Marlene about the 2018 incident. She helped another family whose grandmother was victimized by Vanessa before she married Brian. Her name was Dorothy Collins, Gloria's own mother. It's the same pattern, Leonard. They've done this before." I set the letter down and stared at the wall where Evelyn's photograph hung. She smiled back at me, frozen in a moment of joy we would never share again. But in that smile, I now saw something else. Determination, foresight, love strong enough to reach beyond death itself. "You knew everything," I whispered, "and you made sure I would too." The next morning, I arrived at Marlene's office before she did. The USB drive sat heavy in my pocket, and Evelyn's letter was folded carefully inside my jacket, close to my heart. I had not slept, but exhaustion felt distant compared to the fire burning in my chest. For the first time since my wife's death, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. Marlene unlocked her office at 8 sharp and found me waiting in the hallway. She took one look at my face and knew something had changed. Without a word, she ushered me inside and closed the door. I placed the USB drive on her desk and told her everything. The envelope I had avoided for 18 months, the letter Evelyn had written, the screenshots of messages between Vanessa and Gloria plotting my downfall while my wife was still dying, and the postscript that connected everything to a woman named Dorothy Collins. Marlene listened in silence, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, she plugged the USB into her computer and spent nearly an hour reviewing every file. Finally, she leaned back and removed her reading glasses. "Your wife was remarkable," she said quietly. "She built you a fortress, Leonard. Now we need to make sure no one can tear it down." She pulled a document from her drawer and slid it across the desk. The words "irrevocable trust" were printed at the top in bold letters. "This is your next step," she explained. "Once you sign this, the apartment will be placed in a trust for your granddaughter, Lily. She'll receive full ownership when she turns 25. Until then, the property cannot be sold, transferred, or claimed by anyone else." She paused to ensure I understood. "Not Vanessa, not Brian, not even you. This is a lock without a key." I picked up the pen without hesitation. My hand was steady as I signed my name on each flagged page. With every stroke, I felt Evelyn beside me, her presence warm and approving. She had spent her final months preparing for this moment. I would not let her sacrifice be in vain. When the last signature was complete, Marlene notarized the documents and placed them in a fireproof safe behind her desk. "It's done," she said. "The apartment is protected. Now let me tell you what I found about the 2018 incident." She opened a folder thick with printed records and court documents. Dorothy Collins was Gloria's mother. In 2018, Vanessa convinced her to sign over her house through what investigators called undue influence. Dorothy was 83 years old, recently widowed, and showing early signs of dementia. Vanessa visited her frequently, isolated her from other family members, and eventually persuaded her to transfer the property deed. My stomach tightened as the pattern became clear. A neighbor reported the situation to Adult Protective Services, Marlene continued. An investigation was opened, but before it could proceed, Dorothy withdrew her complaint. Gloria had intervened, convincing her mother that pressing charges would destroy the family. She closed the folder with a heavy sigh. 6 months later, Dorothy died in a nursing home, alone, penniless. The house had been sold, and the money had vanished into accounts controlled by Gloria and Vanessa. I thought of my own situation, the isolation, the questions about my memory, the forged authorization letter, the same pattern, repeated with surgical precision. "Evelyn saw this coming," I said. "She tried to warn me." Marlene nodded. "Your wife recognized the signs because she was watching carefully. Most people don't see the trap until it's already closed." A wave of guilt washed over me then, unexpected and sharp. Brian's face appeared in my mind. My son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had watched graduate from college. I was cutting him out of his inheritance, protecting the apartment from a threat he did not even recognize. "Am I betraying him?" I asked, the words heavy on my tongue. "By doing this, am I punishing my own son?" Marlene's voice softened but did not waver. "You're not punishing Brian. You're protecting Lily from becoming the next victim. Your son is an adult who made his own choices. He chose to marry Vanessa. He chose to stay silent while she isolated you. He chose to let her speak for him." She leaned forward. "Love without boundaries becomes abuse, Leonard. You can still love Brian while refusing to let his wife destroy you. He'll have to choose his own path." I nodded slowly, accepting the truth even as it wounded me. Brian was not innocent, but he was also not beyond redemption. Perhaps one day he would see clearly. Until then, I had to protect what mattered most. That evening, my phone rang with a sound that lifted my spirits. Lily's name glowed on the screen. "Grandpa!" Her voice bubbled with excitement. "Guess what? I got an A on my history project. The one about the Golden Gate Bridge that you helped me with." I smiled for the first time in days. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." We talked for several minutes about school, her friends, and the book she was reading for English class. She was 14 years old, bright and curious, and completely unaware of the darkness surrounding her family. I wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. Then her voice dropped slightly. "Grandpa, can I ask you something weird?" "Of course." "I was looking for scissors in Mom's office, and I found this locked drawer. It wasn't locked all the way, so I opened it." She paused. "There's a whole folder with your name on it, like papers and stuff. Is that normal?" My heart pounded against my ribs. "Lily, listen to me carefully. Don't touch that folder again. Don't mention it to your mother. Can you do that for me?" "Okay," she said slowly, confused but trusting. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, sweetheart. I just need you to trust me." After we said goodbye, I sat in the silence of my apartment, my mind racing. Vanessa had a folder, documents with my name. Whatever she was planning, she had been preparing for longer than I realized. My phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. Her words turned my blood cold. "Leonard, the grandmother wasn't their only victim. My contacts in Florida found records of another case, an elderly man, a family friend who lost his entire retirement savings. Same pattern. Gloria's fingerprints are all over it. We're not dealing with one greedy daughter-in-law. We're dealing with a criminal operation. Call me first thing tomorrow." I set the phone down and stared at the wall where Evelyn's photograph hung. Her smile seemed different now, not just loving, but vigilant. She had seen the wolves circling long before I did, and now, finally, I was ready to fight back. Marlene called early the next morning and asked me to come to her office immediately. Her voice carried an urgency I had not heard before. By the time I arrived, she had transformed her conference table into a war room. Documents spread across the surface in organized clusters: photographs, court records, financial statements. A timeline drawn on a legal pad stretched from one end to the other, spanning 15 years of carefully hidden crimes. "Sit down, Leonard," she said. "What I'm about to show you is worse than we thought." She walked me through her investigation with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Gloria Collins had been connected to at least 3 cases of elder financial exploitation over the past 15 years. Her own mother, Dorothy, was the first confirmed victim. The Florida retiree, a man named Walter Brennan, was the second. I was intended to be the third. Each case followed an identical pattern. First, identify an isolated senior with significant assets. Second, use a family connection or manufactured friendship to gain access and build trust. Third, subtly question the target's mental competency to neighbors, doctors, and anyone who might later serve as a witness. Fourth, pressure or manipulate the victim into transferring assets. Fifth, disappear before anyone realizes what happened. Gloria doesn't get her hands dirty directly, Marlene explained. She uses intermediaries. With Dorothy, it was Vanessa. With Walter Brennan, it was a woman named Patricia who claimed to be his goddaughter. We're still trying to determine if Patricia was another daughter, a hired accomplice, or simply another identity Gloria used. She paused. Only the Dorothy case was ever formally reported, and Gloria made sure that complaint was withdrawn before charges could be filed. I studied the timeline, watching the pattern repeat with sickening clarity. The targets were always elderly, always living alone, always possessing property or savings worth pursuing. The methods were always the same: isolation, competency questioning, pressure, theft. "Why hasn't anyone stopped her?" I asked. Marlene's expression hardened. "Because she's careful. She never stays in one place long enough to establish a pattern that authorities can track. She uses family members as shields. And most importantly, her victims either die before they can testify or are convinced to stay silent." She met my eyes. "You're different, Leonard. You have Evelyn's evidence. You have documentation of the forged deed attempt. And you have me." Before I could respond, a knock interrupted us. Ruth Callahan stood in the doorway, her face pale with concern. Marlene had asked her to come after I mentioned the questions Vanessa had been asking around the neighborhood. Ruth settled into a chair and folded her hands tightly in her lap. "I need to tell you both something," she said. "Last week, I received a phone call from a woman claiming to be conducting a senior wellness survey. She said it was sponsored by some health organization I'd never heard of. She asked about Leonard specifically." My chest tightened. "What kind of questions?" Ruth's voice trembled slightly. "Detailed ones. Your daily routine. What medications you take. Whether you seem confused or forgetful. Whether you've had any falls or accidents recently. She even asked if you'd ever left the stove on or forgotten to lock your door." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. I played along and told her, "You're sharper than anyone I know." "But Leonard," I recognized that voice. It was Gloria. I met her once at Brian's house 2 years ago. She was fishing for evidence to use against you. The room fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy settled over us. This was not Vanessa acting alone out of greed or impatience. This was Gloria's systematic operation, refined over 15 years of practice. Vanessa was merely the instrument, trained from childhood to execute her mother's schemes, and Brian, my own son, was nothing more than a useful fool who provided family access to the target. The apartment had been their goal from before the wedding, perhaps even before Brian and Vanessa met. I thought of Gloria's sharp eyes at family gatherings, the way she always steered conversations toward finances and property values. She had been measuring me for years, waiting for Evelyn to die, waiting for loneliness to make me vulnerable. But I was not vulnerable. Not anymore. "What do we do now?" Ruth asked. I looked at Marlene, then at the document spread across the table. A strange calm settled over me, the same calm I used to feel when examining a failing structure. Panic solved nothing. Analysis solved everything. "In engineering," I said slowly, "you don't demolish a faulty structure immediately. You document every crack first. You photograph every weakness. You calculate exactly where the stress points are and how the collapse will unfold." I met their eyes. "Then, when you're ready, you remove one strategic support, and the whole thing falls in a controlled direction." Marlene smiled faintly. "You want to let them think they're winning." I want them to keep moving forward, I replied. Every step they take creates more evidence. Every scheme they attempt exposes more of their pattern. When we finally act, I want the case to be so complete that no lawyer in the world can save them. That evening, I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on. The city hummed with ordinary life while something extraordinary gathered momentum in the shadows. I felt strangely peaceful, like a man who has finally accepted a battle he cannot avoid. My phone rang just after 9. Ruth's voice came through tight with tension. "Leonard, I just drove past Brian's house on my way home from my daughter's. Gloria is there. Her car has been parked in the driveway for at least a week, maybe longer. She hasn't left." Ruth paused, and I heard her take a shaky breath. I slowed down near the backyard fence. They were outside talking. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught one phrase clearly. Gloria said they need to move the timeline up. I thanked Ruth and ended the call. Then I sat in the darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one above the city. They were accelerating. Whatever they had planned for me, they intended to execute it soon. But they did not know that I was ready. And they did not know that Evelyn had armed me from beyond the grave. The next few days brought revelations that explained everything. Marlene had hired a private investigator with expertise in financial forensics, and his report arrived with devastating clarity. Vanessa was drowning in debt she had hidden from everyone, including her own husband, $85,000. Credit cards maxed across 6 different accounts, balances growing every month as she paid only the minimums. The spending patterns told a story of desperation masked as luxury: designer clothes, spa treatments, a lifestyle she could not afford but refused to abandon. 2 years ago, she had applied for a consolidation loan to bring the debt under control. The application was denied due to her poor credit history and insufficient income. Since then, the interest had compounded relentlessly. The debt collectors had started calling 3 months ago. Marlene's investigator found records of at least a dozen collection attempts, all directed to a phone number Brian did not know existed. Vanessa had been hiding the calls, the letters, the mounting pressure. The apartment was not just a prize she wanted. It was her only way out. "This is why they're accelerating," Marlene said as we reviewed the report in her office. "Vanessa is running out of time. If she can't get control of your assets soon, the collectors will pursue legal action. Garnished wages, ruined credit. Brian will find out everything." She tapped the financial summary. "The apartment is worth $450,000. That's enough to clear her debt 5 times over and still leave plenty for Gloria's cut." Gloria, the puppet master who had been pulling strings for 15 years, Ruth continued her quiet surveillance, reporting what she observed during her evening walks past Brian's house. Gloria had been staying there for 10 days now, her silver sedan permanently parked in the driveway. The two women spent hours in private conversation, often in the backyard where they could not be overheard, but they always fell silent when Brian approached, switching to cheerful small talk about dinner plans or Lily's homework. Brian noticed. Ruth saw him standing at the kitchen window one evening, watching his wife and mother-in-law huddled together near the garden fence. His expression was not suspicious exactly, but it was no longer entirely trusting. Seeds of doubt had been planted, even if he did not recognize them yet. One night, according to Ruth, Brian came home early and entered through the back door without announcing himself. He heard Vanessa's voice drifting from the patio before she realized he was there. "If plan A doesn't work, we have the backup." Brian stepped into view, and both women immediately changed the subject. Vanessa smiled too brightly and asked about his day. Gloria offered to pour him a drink. Neither explained what they had been discussing. Brian said nothing, but Ruth noticed he spent the rest of the evening quieter than usual, replaying those words in his mind without understanding their meaning. I filed that detail away. The backup plan. Marlene and I both knew what it meant. If they could not pressure me into signing over the apartment, they would pursue legal guardianship. They would claim I was mentally incompetent, unable to manage my own affairs. They would use Ruth's fabricated wellness survey and the questions Vanessa had planted with neighbors as evidence. And if they succeeded, they would gain control of everything I owned. 3 days after Ruth's report, my phone rang with a number I almost did not answer. Vanessa. Her voice poured through the speaker like honey, sweet and warm in a way I had not heard in years. "Dad, I'm so glad I caught you. I've been meaning to call for days." I said nothing, waiting for the performance to unfold. Listen, I feel terrible about that dinner situation. There was a misunderstanding with the timing, and I should have handled it better. She paused for effect. Why don't you come over this Sunday? Gloria's visiting, and she'd love to meet you properly. We could all have a nice family meal together. Lily's been asking about you constantly. The mention of Lily was calculated. Vanessa knew my granddaughter was my weakness. I kept my voice neutral. Sunday sounds fine. What time? 6 o'clock. I'll make your favorite pot roast. She had never once made me pot roast. Before she could hang up, I heard another voice in the background. Gloria's tone was low but distinct, coaching her daughter through the call. Tell him it's just family. Make him feel guilty for being distant. Vanessa did not realize I had heard. She continued with rehearsed warmth, promising a wonderful evening and saying how much it would mean to Brian. I agreed to everything, playing the role of the grateful father-in-law who wanted nothing more than reconciliation. When the call ended, I sat in silence, processing what I had learned. Gloria was not even trying to hide her control anymore. She stood beside Vanessa, feeding her lines, directing the manipulation in real time. Whatever they planned for Sunday, it would be Gloria's design executed by Gloria's instrument. I called Marlene immediately and recounted every detail. Her response was measured but firm. They're making their move. That dinner is not about reconciliation. It's about getting you in a controlled environment where they can apply pressure. She paused. They may put documents in front of you, financial power of attorney, medical directives. They'll claim it's routine estate planning, something every family should do. Whatever happens, Leonard, sign nothing. I understand. And one more thing. Her voice dropped lower. Don't let them know you have Evelyn's files. Don't mention the USB or the messages or anything we've discovered. Let them believe they're still in control. The more confident they feel, the more mistakes they'll make. I promised to follow her instructions. When we hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Sunday was 4 days away. 4 days until I sat across the table from the women who had plotted my destruction. But this time, I would not be the prey. I would be the trap. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a calm I did not feel. I dressed carefully, choosing the same blue shirt I had ironed for the dinner that never happened 3 weeks ago. This time, I brought no flowers. This time, I knew exactly what awaited me. Brian answered the door with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He looked tired, older than his 42 years, carrying a weight he did not fully understand. Behind him, the house smelled of roasting meat and something sweeter, a pie perhaps, as if domesticity could mask the predators within. Gloria stood in the living room like a queen surveying her domain. She was 63, with silver hair styled immaculately and eyes that calculated everything they touched. When she saw me, her face arranged itself into warmth, so practiced it almost seemed genuine. "Leonard," she said, crossing the room to embrace me, "how wonderful to finally spend some real time together. You look so healthy for your age." For your age, the first probe, delivered with a smile. "Thank you, Gloria. I try to stay active." She guided me to the couch with a hand on my elbow, as if I needed assistance walking. It must be so difficult, living alone in that big apartment. "Do you ever forget things? Misplace your keys or leave the stove on?" Her tone dripped with concern. "Loneliness can affect memory, you know. Studies have shown that isolated seniors often experience cognitive decline." I met her gaze steadily. "My memory is excellent. I completed the crossword this morning in ink." Something flickered behind her eyes, a flash of frustration quickly suppressed. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, her smile too bright. "Dinner's almost ready. Dad, can I get you something to drink?" The meal unfolded with choreographed pleasantness. Gloria asked about my health, my hobbies, my daily routine. Each question was a fishing line cast into waters she assumed were murky. I answered calmly, revealing nothing, giving her no ammunition. Brian sat mostly silent, pushing food around his plate, glancing between his wife and mother-in-law with an expression I could not quite read. Lily was conspicuously absent. When I asked about her, Vanessa explained she was at a friend's house studying for exams. I suspected they had sent her away deliberately. Whatever they planned tonight, they did not want witnesses. After dessert, the performance reached its climax. Vanessa rose from the table and returned with a manila folder. She slid it across to me with a rehearsed casualness. "Dad, while you're here, there's something we wanted to discuss. Just some routine paperwork." I opened the folder and found exactly what Marlene had predicted. A financial power of attorney, granting Vanessa full authority over my bank accounts, investments, and property in case of emergency. Gloria leaned forward, her voice smooth as silk. It's just a precaution, Leonard. At your age, anything can happen. A fall, a sudden illness. This way, family can step in and help if you become. She paused, selecting her word carefully. Incapacitated. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. His silence was its own betrayal. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I won't be signing this. Vanessa's smile tightened. Dad, it's just a standard document. Everyone does this. No. My voice remained calm, but firm. I should tell you something, all of you. The apartment is no longer available. Gloria's expression froze. Last week, I placed it in an irrevocable trust for Lily. She will receive full ownership when she turns 25. Until then, no one can touch it. I looked directly at Vanessa, not you, not Brian, not even me. The documents are filed. It's done. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa's face drained of color. Brian stared at me with something between shock and confusion. But Gloria's mask shattered completely. She slammed both palms on the table, rattling the dishes. You did what? Her voice rose to a pitch I had never heard, raw and furious. That apartment belongs to this family. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've been planning this since before Vanessa even married your son. She stopped mid-sentence. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Gloria realized too late what she had confessed. Brian turned to stare at his mother-in-law. Planning what? Since before the wedding? Gloria's mouth opened and closed. Vanessa grabbed her arm, hissing something urgent, but the damage was done. 15 years of careful manipulation, exposed in a single moment of rage. I stood slowly, buttoning my jacket. The room remained frozen as I walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me. No one could find words. At the threshold, I paused and looked back at my son. His face held confusion, hurt, and the beginning of something else, understanding. I felt no triumph, only a deep and heavy sorrow. Now you know who you married into, son. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Through the wood, I heard Gloria's voice erupt again, screaming at Vanessa. Fix this. Do whatever it takes. Call the lawyer. We'll contest the trust. I walked to my car without hurrying. As I opened the door, I glanced back at the house one final time. Brian stood at the window watching me. He did not wave. He did not look away. Something had shifted behind his eyes. Whether it would grow into action or fade into denial, only time would tell. I drove home through the quiet streets, Evelyn's voice echoing in my memory. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Tonight, I had drawn the boundary. Tonight, I had shown them that the old man they had underestimated was not as helpless as they believed. The war was far from over, but the first battle belonged to me. The knock came at 7 the next morning. I had barely slept, replaying Gloria's outburst and the look on Brian's face as I left. When I opened the door, my son stood in the hallway looking like a man who had aged a decade overnight. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled as if he had dressed without thinking. He did not greet me. He simply walked past me into the apartment and stood in the middle of the living room, staring at nothing. I couldn't sleep, he said finally. His voice was hoarse. Her words keep playing in my head. I've been planning this since before Vanessa married your son. What does that mean, Dad? Was my whole marriage a lie? I closed the door and gestured toward the couch. Brian sat heavily, dropping his head into his hands. I had imagined this conversation many times, but now that it was happening, I felt no satisfaction, only sadness for the pain my son was finally allowing himself to feel. Dad, he said, looking up at me with desperate eyes. Everything Vanessa told me about you, that you were getting confused, that you were difficult, that you wanted to control our lives, was any of it true? I walked to my desk and retrieved a document I had been saving for this moment. The mental competency evaluation, completed 3 weeks ago by a licensed psychologist. I handed it to Brian without comment. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing. The report was thorough and unambiguous. Completely sane. Sharp cognition, No impairment detected. Excellent memory and reasoning skills. The psychologist had noted that I was more mentally acute than many patients half my age. Brian's hands trembled as he set the paper down. She told me you were declining. She said the neighbors had noticed. She said it was only a matter of time before you hurt yourself living alone. Ruth Callahan has been my neighbor for 15 years, I replied. Ask her yourself whether I've shown any signs of confusion, but I suspect Vanessa never expected you to actually check. Something crumbled in Brian's expression. The foundation of lies he had accepted for years was cracking, and the pain of seeing clearly was written across his face. I decided to share more, though not everything. He was not ready for Evelyn's USB or the full scope of Gloria's criminal history, but he needed enough truth to find the rest himself. I told him about the deed fraud from 2 years ago, how Vanessa had attempted to add her name to my apartment without authorization. I showed him the title company's rejection letter, the forged verbal authorization that had been flagged as suspicious. His face grew paler with each revelation. Then I told him about the debt. $85,000 hidden across 6 credit cards, collectors calling a phone number he did not know existed. His wife had been drowning for 2 years and never said a word. Finally, I mentioned Dorothy Collins, Vanessa's grandmother, the house that was stolen, the complaint that was withdrawn, the old woman who died alone in a nursing home while her family counted her money. Brian sat in stunned silence when I finished. The man before me was not the dismissive son who had canceled dinners and defended his wife's cruelty. This was a man whose world had shattered, who was only beginning to understand how completely he had been deceived. I'm not asking you to believe me, I said gently. I'm asking you to find the truth yourself. Watch. Listen. Pay attention to things you've been trained to ignore. The evidence is there if you're willing to see it. Brian left without another word, his shoulders heavy with the burden of new knowledge. I watched from the window as his car pulled away, uncertain whether he would retreat into denial or push forward into painful clarity. What happened next, I learned only later. Brian returned home and found Vanessa and Gloria in the kitchen, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. They did not hear him enter through the side door. He stood in the hallway, listening. Gloria's voice carried clearly. The guardianship petition is our best option now. We claim he's mentally unfit, get control of his finances, and challenge that trust in court. I know a doctor in Nevada who will write whatever we need. Vanessa nodded. How long will it take? A few weeks if we move fast. Once we have legal authority, the trust becomes contestable. We can argue he wasn't competent when he signed it. Brian retreated silently before they noticed him. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The backup plan. The words his father had warned him about. They were going to declare me incompetent and steal everything through the courts. That night, Brian lay awake beside his sleeping wife, the woman he had loved for 8 years, the woman who had borne his daughter, the woman who had been lying to him since before he proposed. He pulled out his phone and opened the App Store. His fingers moved with quiet determination, searching for something he had never imagined needing, a voice recording application. Free, highly rated, runs silently in the background. He downloaded it and watched the icon appear on his home screen. His thumb hovered over it as Vanessa shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I will know the truth. Not from my father, not from documents, from her own mouth. Brian set the phone on his nightstand and stared at the ceiling until dawn crept through the curtains. What happened next, I pieced together from Brian's own account in the days that followed. He told me everything, his voice hollow with the weight of truths he wished he had never discovered. The morning after downloading the recording app, Brian woke early with a single purpose. Vanessa was already moving around the bedroom, gathering clothes for her shower. She left her phone on the nightstand as she always did, never imagining her husband would touch it. In 8 years of marriage, he never had. Today was different. The moment the bathroom door closed and the water began running, Brian reached for the device. His hands shook as he entered her passcode, a combination he had seen her type 1,000 times without ever thinking to use. The phone unlocked, and he navigated to her messages with Gloria. The conversation history stretched back years, hundreds of exchanges, thousands of words, a chronicle of deception he had never suspected. Brian scrolled to the earliest messages, dated 3 months before their wedding, and began to read. Gloria had written, Remember the plan. His father has property worth nearly $500,000. Be patient. We did the same with Grandma. It took 5 years, but we got everything." Vanessa's reply appeared beneath it. "I know, Mom. Brian is clueless. He actually thinks I love him for him." Brian told me he read that line 3 times. Each reading drove the knife deeper. The woman sleeping beside him for 8 years, the mother of his daughter, had never loved him. He was a tool, a means to an end, a bridge to his father's apartment. He forced himself to keep scrolling, moving forward through the years. The messages painted a portrait of calculated manipulation, discussions about isolating me from Brian, strategies for making me seem confused or difficult, celebrations when family dinners were canceled and I grew more distant. The recent messages were worse. Gloria had written 2 weeks ago, "If the old man won't sign, we file for conservatorship. Claim he's mentally unstable. I know a doctor in Nevada who'll write whatever we need for $5,000. Same one we used for Grandma." Vanessa replied, "What about the Florida situation? Is Walter still a problem?" Gloria's response chilled Brian to the bone. "Dead 3 months ago. Heart failure in the nursing home. No witnesses left." Brian stared at the screen, realizing what those words meant. Dorothy Collins, Walter Brennan, now me. 3 elderly targets, at least 2 of them dead, their assets consumed by the mother-daughter operation that had infiltrated his family. He was not married to a greedy woman. He was married to a predator trained by a more experienced predator. A voice from the doorway shattered his focus. "Dad, what are you doing with Mom's phone?" Lily stood in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep, her eyes curious and confused. Brian's heart lurched. His 14-year-old daughter, innocent and trusting, had no idea what kind of household she lived in. He locked the phone quickly and forced a casual tone. "Just checking something, sweetheart. Go get ready for school." Lily hesitated, sensing something wrong, but she nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Brian sat motionless, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. His daughter needed protection. My words echoed in his mind. Find the truth yourself. He had found it. Now he needed to preserve it. Working quickly, Brian reopened Vanessa's messages and began taking screenshots. Every damning exchange, every reference to past victims, every mention of the guardianship scheme. He sent them to his own phone, watching the files transfer with excruciating slowness. The shower was still running, but he could not know how much time remained. When the last screenshot was saved, he deleted the sent messages from Vanessa's phone, erasing any trace of what he had done. He placed the device exactly where she had left it, adjusting the angle to match his memory. Then he retreated to the kitchen, poured himself coffee he could not taste, and waited for his wife to emerge. Vanessa appeared 20 minutes later, dressed and smiling, her mask perfectly in place. "Good morning, honey. Sleep well?" Brian nodded, not trusting his voice. She kissed his cheek, grabbed her phone, and began scrolling through notifications with no sign of suspicion. He watched her from across the kitchen, seeing clearly for the first time the stranger he had shared his life with. That night, I was awakened by my phone buzzing on the nightstand. The screen glowed in the darkness, showing Brian's name and a message sent at 2 in the morning. "Dad, you were right. I'm sorry. About everything." I found proof on her phone messages going back years. They planned this before we were even married. "Grandma Dorothy, a man in Florida. You were next. I'm going to get more proof, real proof that will hold up in court, whatever it takes." I read the message twice, then set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. My son had finally seen the truth. The crack I had noticed at the dinner had widened into a chasm, and Brian was choosing to stand on my side of it. But the battle was far from over. Vanessa and Gloria were still dangerous. They would not surrender their scheme easily, especially now that the apartment was beyond their reach. "Desperate people do desperate things," I typed a careful reply. "I'm proud of you, son. Be careful. Don't let them know you suspect anything. We'll talk tomorrow." Then I lay back and waited for dawn, knowing that the most dangerous phase of this war was only beginning. The 3 days that followed were the longest of Brian's life. He told me later that every moment felt like walking through enemy territory while wearing a mask that might slip at any second. But he held steady, playing the role of the obedient husband who had accepted his father's supposed decline. When Vanessa complained about my stubbornness, Brian nodded sympathetically. When Gloria strategized about legal options over dinner, he listened attentively and offered no objection. Each night after Vanessa fell asleep, he retreated to the bathroom and tested his recording app, making sure he understood every function, every setting, every way to capture evidence without detection. He was no longer the passive son who avoided conflict. He was a man with a mission, gathering intelligence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on the third evening. Brian was helping Lily with homework at the kitchen table when Vanessa's phone rang. Gloria's name flashed on the screen. Vanessa answered with a smile, and what happened next was either carelessness or overconfidence. She pressed the speaker button so Brian could hear. "I have good news," Gloria announced, her voice bright with satisfaction. "The doctor in Nevada is ready. For $5,000, he'll certify that Leonard is mentally incompetent. I've already sent him the preliminary information we gathered. He says it's more than enough." Brian felt his blood turn cold, but he kept his expression neutral. Beneath the table, his hand moved slowly to his pocket. His fingers found his phone and activated the recording app with a single practice swipe. The red indicator blinked once and disappeared, capturing every word. Gloria continued without pause. "We file the guardianship petition next week. The court will appoint us as conservators within a month, maybe less. Once we have legal control over his finances, we challenge that trust. We argue he wasn't mentally competent when he signed it. The whole thing unravels." Vanessa leaned against the counter, her posture relaxed, her voice chillingly casual. "Same process as Grandma. Easy. He won't even understand what's happening until it's done." Gloria laughed, the sound crackling through the speaker. "That's my girl. You've learned well. And if it works like Florida, he'll be in a nursing home within 6 months. Once they're institutionalized, the rest is paperwork. We'll have everything, the apartment, his savings, whatever else he's hidden away." Brian's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain still. Lily had looked up from her textbook, sensing tension in the room. He smiled at her reassuringly and gestured for her to continue reading. Vanessa glanced at Brian with a smirk. "Remember how confused Mr. Patterson looked when we took his house? He kept asking where his wife was, even though she'd been dead for 3 years. Old people never see it coming. They trust too easily." Gloria's voice dropped lower, conspiratorial. "That's why we target them. Isolation plus age plus family access equals opportunity. Your father-in-law was supposed to be the easiest one yet. If he hadn't put that apartment in trust, we'd already be done." "We'll fix it," Vanessa said confidently. "The guardianship gives us everything we need. Once we control his legal affairs, that trust is just paper." The call ended with promises to finalize the petition over the weekend. Vanessa returned to preparing dinner as if she had been discussing nothing more significant than grocery lists. Brian excused himself to check on something in the garage, and there, alone among tools and old boxes, he stopped the recording. His hands trembled as he played it back through his earbuds. Every word was clear. Premeditation, multiple victims by name, bribery of a medical professional, conspiracy to commit fraud, references to Dorothy Collins, Walter Patterson in Florida, and now me. They had done this before, and they had left destruction in their wake. Brian saved the file to 3 different locations, his phone, his email, and a cloud drive Vanessa did not know existed. Then he returned to the kitchen, finished helping Lily with her homework, and sat through a dinner that tasted like ash. That night, after Vanessa's breathing deepened into sleep, Brian slipped out of bed, dressed silently, and drove across the city to my apartment. When I opened the door at midnight, his face held an expression I had never seen on my son before. Determination hardened by grief, resolve forged in betrayal. "I got it," he said simply. "Everything." We sat together in my living room, the city silent beyond the windows. Brian connected his phone to my old speaker system, and Gloria's voice filled the room. I listened without interrupting, hearing the casual cruelty, the references to Grandma in Florida, the laughter about confused old people who trusted too easily. When the recording ended, silence stretched between us. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and saw not the weak man who had failed to defend me, but someone transformed by the weight of terrible knowledge. "What do you want to do now?" I asked quietly. Brian met my eyes without flinching. His voice was steady, perhaps steadier than I had ever heard it. "I want justice," he said. "Real justice. Not just for you, Dad. For Grandma Dorothy. For Mr. Patterson. For everyone they've destroyed." He paused, and I saw tears threatening at the edges of his eyes, held back by sheer will. "And for Lily. I need to protect her from becoming part of this. She deserves better than a mother who sees people as prey." I reached across and placed my hand on his shoulder. The gesture said what words could not. Pride. Forgiveness. The beginning of something that might, in time, heal the wounds between us. "Then we do this together," I said. "We take this to Marlene tomorrow, and we end this the right way." Brian nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, pale and fragile, but undeniably present. A new day was coming, and with it, the reckoning Gloria and Vanessa had never imagined. The morning after Brian brought me the recording, we delivered it to Marlene together. She listened in her office with the door locked, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. When the audio ended, she sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "This is enough," she said quietly. "Premeditation, multiple victims, bribery, conspiracy across state lines. This isn't just elder abuse anymore. This is organized crime." She made copies of the file immediately, storing them in multiple secure locations. Then she picked up her phone and called the district attorney's office directly. I watched as she explained the situation in crisp, professional terms, referencing case numbers and legal precedents I did not fully understand. By the end of the call, an investigation had been opened, but we were not the only ones making moves. Brian continued his surveillance at home, reporting to me each evening about the growing tension between Vanessa and Gloria. His distance had not gone unnoticed. Where he once defended his wife reflexively, he now offered only silence. Where he once engaged with Gloria's scheming, he now excused himself from conversations. The change was subtle, but predators are sensitive to shifts in their environment. Ruth called me 3 days later with troubling news. She had overheard Gloria and Vanessa arguing in the backyard, their voices carrying over the fence in the evening air. "He's pulling away," Gloria had snapped. "I've seen this before. When the husband starts getting quiet, it means he's thinking. We need to act fast before he becomes a liability." Vanessa's response was defensive. "He doesn't know anything. He's just tired from work." "Don't be naive. Your husband visited his father twice this week. They're talking, planning." Gloria's voice turned cold and strategic. "We need to control the story before they control it. If Leonard goes public first, we lose everything." Ruth told me Gloria had paced the yard like a general mapping a battlefield. Her solution was bold and ruthless. They would launch a preemptive strike, turning public opinion against me before I could expose them. "Call that reporter friend of yours," Gloria instructed, "the one who covered the charity gala last year. Tell her you have a story about elder abuse, but not the kind people expect. Tell her Leonard has been emotionally abusing you for years, controlling, manipulative, that you've been afraid to speak out because of his influence in the community." Vanessa hesitated. "Will anyone believe that? They'll believe a crying daughter-in-law before they believe a bitter old man. Play the victim, make the first move. By the time he tries to respond, your version will already be the truth." The plan took shape over the following days. Brian watched helplessly as Vanessa crafted her narrative, rehearsing lines in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting her expressions to project vulnerability and fear. Gloria coached her on which details to emphasize and which to invent. The story they constructed bore no resemblance to reality, but it was designed to be compelling rather than accurate. Then came the social media post. Brian forwarded it to me the moment it appeared. Vanessa had written, "Sometimes the people we trust most become our greatest abusers. For years I've suffered in silence, afraid to speak out against a powerful man who controlled my family with manipulation and cruelty. I've been told to stay quiet. I've been told no one would believe me. But I refuse to be silenced any longer. My truth will be told this Saturday at 10 a.m. on the county courthouse steps. If you've ever felt trapped by someone who should have protected you, stand with me. Number survivor story. Number elder abuse goes both ways. Number break the silence." Within hours, the post had been shared 300 times. Comments poured in from strangers, offering support and solidarity. A local television station reached out requesting an interview. A newspaper columnist asked for an exclusive statement. Vanessa had successfully positioned herself as a victim, and the public was eager to embrace her story. I read the post several times, feeling the weight of the lies pressing against my chest. She was painting me as a monster, while she and her mother plotted to steal everything I had built. The injustice of it burned, but I forced myself to remain calm. Marlene had warned me this might happen. Desperate people make desperate moves. What Vanessa did not know was that the ground beneath her performance was already crumbling. Marlene had been working with the district attorney's office around the clock. Brian's recording, combined with the documentary evidence from Evelyn's USB and the pattern of previous victims, had provided more than enough for charges. Investigators had already begun tracing the doctor in Nevada, the money trails to Gloria's accounts, and the connections to Dorothy Collins and Walter Patterson. Arrest warrants were being prepared. The night before the scheduled press conference, Marlene called me with news that made my heart pound. "The DA has everything they need," she said, her voice carrying a satisfaction I had never heard before. "Warrants for Vanessa and Gloria will be signed tomorrow morning. But here's the interesting part." She paused, and I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "They've agreed to let her have her press conference first." I frowned. Why would they do that? Because she's about to stand in front of cameras and claim to be a victim of abuse. She's going to tell her story to every reporter in the city. Marlene's voice dropped lower. And then, in front of those same cameras, the police are going to arrest her. They're going to play Brian's recording for the media. They're going to show the world exactly who Vanessa Grant really is. I sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of what she was describing. Justice will be very, very public, Leonard. She wanted the spotlight. Now she's going to get it. Saturday morning arrived with a sky so clear it seemed almost cruel. I dressed in a simple gray suit, the one Evelyn had picked out for me years ago, and drove to the county courthouse with a calm I had not expected to feel. Whatever happened today, the truth would finally be spoken aloud. The rest was in hands more capable than mine. The courthouse steps were already crowded when I arrived. Reporters jostled for position, cameras mounted on tripods, microphones bristling like a forest of black stems. Curious onlookers gathered at the edges, drawn by the promise of drama that Vanessa's viral post had created. I found a spot at the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a stone pillar, and waited. Vanessa appeared precisely at 10 o'clock, ascending the steps like an actress taking the stage. She wore white, a flowing dress that caught the morning light and projected an image of purity and vulnerability. Her makeup was subtle, designed to make her look tired and fragile. She clutched a tissue in one hand, ready to dab at tears that had not yet been summoned. Gloria sat in the front row of folding chairs that had been arranged for supporters. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her posture radiating maternal concern. She smiled at her daughter with an expression of encouragement, the proud mother watching her child perform. Brian stood to the side, near the edge of the crowd. His face was unreadable, his hands clasped in front of him. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a supportive husband waiting for his wife to speak. Only I knew the truth burning behind his calm exterior. Vanessa approached the microphone, adjusting it with trembling hands. She surveyed the crowd, found the cameras, and began. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice quivering with rehearsed emotion. "What I'm about to share has been locked inside me for 8 years. I've been afraid to speak, afraid no one would believe me, afraid of what he might do." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. "My father-in-law, Leonard Grant, has controlled my family since the day I married his son. He manipulated my husband, isolated us from friends, and tried to turn our own daughter against us. When I finally stood up to him, he retaliated by hiding assets that should have belonged to our family. He's trying to steal our daughter's future out of spite." Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Cameras zoomed in on her trembling lip. "I have been a victim of emotional abuse for nearly a decade, and today I refuse to be silent any longer." The crowd murmured with sympathy. Gloria nodded approvingly from her seat. The performance was flawless. Then Marlene stepped forward. She emerged from the side of the courthouse, walking with the deliberate pace of someone who held all the cards. In her hand was a laptop, its screen dark but ready. The crowd parted for her instinctively, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "If we're discussing truth today," Marlene said, her voice carrying clearly across the steps, "then let's hear all of it." Vanessa's smile faltered. "Excuse me? Who are you?" Marlene did not answer. Instead, She connected her laptop to the courthouse's external speaker system, a setup that had been arranged hours earlier with the cooperation of the district attorney's office. She pressed a single key. Vanessa's voice filled the air, amplified for everyone to hear. Same process as Grandma. Easy. He won't even understand what's happening until it's done. The crowd went silent. Vanessa's face drained of color. Gloria's voice followed, crackling through the speakers with chilling clarity. That's my girl, and if it works like Florida, he'll be in a nursing home within 6 months, and we'll have everything. Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters exchanged stunned glances. Cameras swung wildly between Vanessa's frozen expression and the laptop in Marlene's hands. Then Brian walked to the microphone. His hands shook, but his voice did not break. He looked directly into the cameras, directly at the crowd, directly at the wife he had loved and the life he was leaving behind. I recorded that conversation, he said. 3 nights ago, in our kitchen. My wife and her mother have been targeting vulnerable elderly people for over 15 years. They destroyed my grandmother-in-law. They destroyed a man named Walter Patterson in Florida. And my father was supposed to be their next victim. He paused, steadying himself. I refused to be complicit anymore. 2 uniformed officers appeared at the top of the courthouse steps. They moved with quiet authority, positioning themselves on either side of Vanessa. Vanessa Grant, Gloria Collins, one of them announced, loud enough for every microphone to capture, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder fraud, forgery, and exploitation of vulnerable adults across 3 states. You have the right to remain silent." Gloria erupted from her seat, her composure shattering completely. "This is your fault," she screamed at Vanessa as officers approached her. "You were supposed to control him. I taught you everything, and you let a stupid recording destroy us." The officers handcuffed Gloria first, her screams dissolving into incoherent fury as they led her down the steps. Vanessa stood paralyzed, watching her mother being taken away, the white dress now a mockery of the innocence she had tried to project. When the second pair of officers took Vanessa's arms, she did not resist. She looked back once at Brian, standing tall by the microphone, at me, emerging from behind the pillar, at the cameras capturing every moment of her destruction. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa's eyes held no calculation, no strategy, no predatory gleam, only terror. The officers guided her down the steps, past the reporters shouting questions, past the crowd that had gathered to support her, and now stared in horrified silence. Mother and daughter passed each other on the sidewalk, Gloria being loaded into one patrol car, Vanessa into another. Neither looked at the other. I watched until both cars disappeared around the corner, their sirens fading into the distance. Then I turned and found Brian standing beside me, his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. "It's over," he whispered. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "No, son, it's just beginning, but the hardest part is done." The 2 days following the arrest passed in a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. The news coverage was relentless. Every local station replayed the footage of Vanessa and Gloria being led away in handcuffs. Reporters camped outside Brian's house, outside my apartment, outside the courthouse. The story had captured the public's attention in a way none of us had anticipated. Brian stayed with me during those first nights, unable to face the home he had shared with a woman he no longer recognized. We spoke little, sitting together in the quiet of my living room, processing the enormity of what had happened. Lily remained with a trusted friend from school, shielded as much as possible from the media frenzy surrounding her mother's arrest. On the 3rd morning, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, Lily stood in the hallway, clutching a small metal box against her chest. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair uncombed, her clothes wrinkled as if she had dressed without thinking. She looked so small, so fragile, so utterly lost. "Grandpa," she said, her voice trembling, "I found this in Mom's closet. She always kept it locked, but she forgot her keys when the police came." She held the box toward me with shaking hands. "I think you need to see what's inside." I ushered her in and closed the door against the world. We sat together on the couch, the metal box between us like an unexploded device. Lily had not opened it. She had carried it across the city without knowing its contents, trusting that whatever secrets it held belonged in my hands rather than hers. My heart ached for her. 14 years old, and she was already braver than most adults I had known. She had watched her mother be arrested on live television. She had heard the recording that revealed the truth about her family. And now she was delivering evidence that might deepen the wounds even further. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside, I found documents. Official-looking papers with seals and signatures and legal language that made my blood run cold. Transfer agreements for the apartment, and at the bottom of each page, my wife's signature. Except Evelyn had never signed these papers. She could not have. 2 weeks before her death, she was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness as the cancer claimed the last of her strength. She had not held a pen in over a month by then. The forgery was expert level. Someone had studied Evelyn's handwriting carefully, replicating the curves and angles with painstaking precision. If I had not known my wife's signature as intimately as my own heartbeat, I might have been fooled. Beneath the forged transfer papers lay something even more disturbing, a handwritten list, clearly in Gloria's precise script, containing names, addresses, and financial estimates. Potential targets. Each entry included notes about the person's health, family situation, and what Gloria called vulnerability assessment. One column listed estimated asset values. Another noted which family member could be used to gain access. There were 7 names on the list. 3 had been crossed out: Dorothy Collins, Walter Patterson, and at the bottom, with a star beside it, my own name, Leonard Grant. Apartment value $450K, wife deceased, son married to V. High vulnerability, easy access. I set the papers down and closed my eyes. If Vanessa had succeeded in her original plan, if I had signed over the apartment or been declared incompetent, these forged documents would have been her insurance policy. She would have used them to challenge the irrevocable trust, claiming that Evelyn had already agreed to transfer the property before her death. My wife's protection, built with such care and foresight, would have been undone by a dead woman's forged signature. The evil of it took my breath away. Lily watched me with wide, frightened eyes. "Grandpa, what is it? What did Mom do?" I could not lie to her. She deserved truth, even when truth was painful. "Your mother was planning to steal this apartment," I said gently. "She created fake documents to make it look like your grandmother agreed to give it away. If she had succeeded, everything your grandmother worked to protect would have been lost." Lily's face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the full weight of her mother's betrayal settled over her. "She was going to hurt you," she whispered, "like she hurt everyone else, like she hurt great-grandma Dorothy." I pulled her into my arms and held her as she sobbed. Her shoulders shook with grief too large for her young heart to contain. I stroked her hair and let her cry, offering no false comfort, only presence. "Your grandmother saw this coming," I said softly. "She prepared everything she could to protect us. And now you finished what she started. You brought this box to me when you could have ignored it. You chose truth over loyalty to someone who didn't deserve it." I pulled back and looked into her tear-stained face. "Evelyn would be so proud of you, Lily. I know I am." We turned the documents over to Marlene that afternoon. She immediately contacted the district attorney's office. The forgery evidence elevated the charges significantly. What had been financial fraud now included felony document falsification, a crime carrying an additional 5 to 10 years in prison. Gloria's handwritten target list provided evidence of a systematic criminal enterprise spanning multiple states and more than a decade. That evening, after the lawyers had left and the apartment had grown quiet, Lily sat beside me on the couch where Evelyn and I had spent so many peaceful hours together. She stared at her hands for a long moment before speaking. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "can I live with you? I don't want to go back to that house. I don't want to be around her things, her pictures, her lies." Her voice broke. "I don't want to be anything like her." I turned to face my granddaughter, seeing in her eyes the same fierce determination that had defined Evelyn, the same courage, the same refusal to accept injustice. "You are nothing like her," I said firmly. "You never were. You have your grandmother's heart, Lily, her honesty, her bravery." I took her hands in mine. "And yes, this is your home now, for as long as you want it." She collapsed against me, crying again, but this time the tears carried something different: relief, gratitude, the beginning of healing. I held her tighter and looked at Evelyn's photograph on the wall. My wife smiled back at me, frozen in a moment of joy, her work finally complete. We had won. and Lily was safe. 1 year passed. Seasons turned. The wounds began to heal, though the scars remained. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray November morning, exactly 12 months after the arrests that had shattered our family and rebuilt it in a new shape. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom beside Brian and Lily, watching as justice finally delivered its verdict. Vanessa appeared first, escorted by marshals in her orange jumpsuit, her hair limp and her face hollow. The confident predator who had climbed the courthouse steps in white was gone. In her place stood a diminished woman who had chosen to plead guilty rather than face the full weight of trial. Her attorney had negotiated the agreement, but the terms were still severe. 7 years in federal prison for multi-state elder fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. No possibility of early release. Gloria came next, and the transformation in her was even more striking. The silver-haired mastermind who had orchestrated 15 years of exploitation now shuffled into the courtroom with the defeated posture of someone who knew her empire had crumbled. The judge showed no mercy. As the architect of the criminal enterprise, Gloria received 12 years with no possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read, the gravity of her crimes requiring no commentary. The case had become a landmark for elder protection law. Legal scholars cited it in journals. Advocacy groups used it in training materials. Prosecutors in Florida reopened the investigation into Dorothy Collins and Walter Patterson, reclassifying both deaths as suspicious. The ripples of accountability spread far beyond our family, touching victims who had never received justice and preventing future crimes that would now never occur. Brian had testified against his wife as a cooperating witness. His testimony provided crucial context for the jury, explaining how the scheme operated from within the family. The cooperation reduced his own legal exposure, but it cost him everything else: his marriage, his reputation, his sense of who he was. In the months that followed, he began therapy, learning to recognize the patterns of manipulation that had controlled him for nearly a decade. He filed for divorce and won full custody of Lily, with me named as co-guardian. He sold the house where so many lies had been told and moved into a small apartment 3 blocks from mine. After the sentencing concluded and the courtroom emptied, I found Brian standing alone in the hallway. His eyes were red, his shoulders bowed under the weight of everything he had witnessed. When he saw me approaching, he did something I had not expected. He knelt, right there on the cold marble floor. My son dropped to his knees and looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, "I should have believed you from the beginning. I should have protected you instead of enabling them. I failed you. I failed Mom. I failed Lily. I don't know how to live with that." I reached down and took his hands, pulling him gently to his feet. The hallway was empty now, just the two of us standing in the aftermath of a storm that had nearly destroyed everything. "You chose right when it mattered most," I said firmly. "You found the truth. You recorded the evidence. You stood in front of cameras and testified against the woman you had loved. That is not failure, Brian. That is redemption." I gripped his shoulders. "Now we rebuild. Together." He embraced me then, holding on as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had shifted beneath him. I held him back, feeling the boy I had raised finally returning to the man he was meant to become. The apartment remained in trust for Lily, exactly as I had intended. But I had added one provision in the months since the arrest. The property could never be sold, only passed down through generations of our family. And on the deed, inscribed permanently in the legal record, was Evelyn's name as co-protector. Her legacy would endure long after all of us were gone. That evening, we gathered in my apartment for dinner. Brian had brought groceries and insisted on cooking, a skill he was slowly relearning. Lily set the table with the good china Evelyn had saved for special occasions. The apartment filled with warmth and laughter and the smell of roasting vegetables, sounds and scents that had been absent for far too long. When the meal was ready, we sat together in the dining room where Evelyn and I had shared 41 years of conversations. Brian raised his glass, his hand steady now, his eyes clear. "To Mom," he said. "She saw everything before we did. She protected us when we couldn't protect ourselves." Lily raised her glass next, her voice soft but certain, "And she saved us from beyond, like a guardian angel with really good lawyers." We laughed, the sound genuine and healing. I looked at Evelyn's photograph on the mantel, her smile unchanged, her presence still filling every corner of the home she had loved. She always was the smarter one, I said, raising my own glass. To Evelyn, we drank together, a family broken and rebuilt, scarred but whole. Another year has passed since the sentencing, and I hardly recognize the life I now live. The apartment that once echoed with loneliness now hums with purpose and connection. The silence that followed Evelyn's death has been replaced by laughter, conversation, and the steady rhythm of a family rebuilding itself one day at a time. Lily thrives in ways I never dared to hope. She lives with me during the week, her bedroom decorated with photographs of Evelyn and posters of the colleges she dreams of attending. Her grades have soared, her confidence has blossomed. On weekends, she visits Brian at his apartment 3 blocks away, and the two of them are slowly learning to know each other without Vanessa's shadow between them. But what makes me proudest is what Lily has chosen to do with her pain. Every Saturday morning, she volunteers at the Riverside Senior Center, spending hours with elderly residents who have no family to visit them. She helps them balance checkbooks, reviews suspicious mail for signs of scams, and teaches them to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. Grandma Evelyn would have wanted me to protect others, she told me when I asked why she devoted so much time to strangers. She saved us. Now I want to save someone else. The words struck me so deeply that I knew I had to do more. With Marlene's help, I established the Evelyn Grant Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to providing legal resources for elderly victims of family financial abuse. We offer free consultations, connect seniors with trustworthy attorneys, and fund education programs in community centers across the state. Marlene serves as board counsel, donating countless hours to the cause. Ruth organizes community events, recruiting her vast network of retired friends to spread awareness. The foundation's motto appears on every brochure, every flyer, every piece of correspondence. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Kindness with wisdom is protection. Evelyn's words, living on in service to others. Brian has transformed in ways I once thought impossible. The passive man who avoided conflict and enabled his wife's cruelty has become an advocate in his own right. He speaks at financial literacy seminars, standing before audiences of family members and caregivers to share his story. He tells them how abusers manipulate loved ones into complicity, how they use guilt and obligation to silence suspicion. I was blind because I wanted to be, he says at every presentation. I saw warning signs and chose to ignore them because facing the truth was too painful. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for permission to see what's right in front of you. His honesty has helped more people than he knows. After every seminar, strangers approach him with tears in their eyes, thanking him for giving them the courage to ask difficult questions about their own families. He has turned his shame into purpose, his guilt into service. This afternoon, I sit in my armchair by the window, the same chair where I have spent so many hours watching the city below. In my hands is Evelyn's letter, the cream-colored paper soft from being read so many times. I know every word by heart now, but I still unfold it carefully, reverently, letting her voice fill my mind one more time. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Protect yourself. Protect Lily. I love you eternally. The front door bursts open, and Lily rushes in with the energy that defines her now. Her backpack swings from one shoulder, her cheeks flushed from the autumn wind. Grandpa, Dad's on the phone. He wants to know if we're still having Sunday dinner tomorrow. I fold the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with my fingertips, and slide it back into the envelope. Then I look up at Evelyn's photograph on the wall, the same photograph that has watched over me through grief and betrayal and redemption. Her smile seems different now, warmer, peaceful, as if she can finally rest, knowing her work is complete. We did it, Evelyn, I whisper, too softly for Lily to hear. The family is whole again, built the right way this time. Lily holds out the phone, bouncing impatiently on her heels. Grandpa, what should I tell him? I rise from the chair, feeling stronger than I have in years. The apartment surrounds me with memories of the woman I loved and the life we built together. But it also holds something new now. Hope, future, the promise of generations yet to come. I take the phone from Lily's hand, my voice strong and clear. Tell your father yes, Sunday dinner, and every Sunday after. I smile at my granddaughter, at the photograph on the wall, at the life that stretches ahead of us. That's what family does. Leonard Grant thought he was just a lonely widower waiting out his final years. Instead, he became a warrior who proved that age is not weakness and silence is not surrender. His wife Evelyn, even from beyond the grave, showed us that true love means protecting those we cherish long after we are gone. And Brian, the son who nearly lost everything to blindness and denial, demonstrated that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to face the truth. This story reminds us that predators do not always wear masks. Sometimes they sit at our dinner tables, call us family, and wait patiently for the moment to strike. But it also reminds us that we are never as helpless as they believe. With wisdom, preparation, and the courage to draw boundaries, even the most vulnerable among us can rise up and reclaim what is rightfully ours. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. A parent living alone, a friend caring for elderly relatives, a family member who might be ignoring warning signs. Your share could be the wake-up call that saves someone from becoming the next victim. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think. Have you ever witnessed someone being taken advantage of by their own family? What would you have done in Leonard's situation? Your stories matter, and we read every single one. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Until next time, remember Evelyn's words. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used, but kindness with wisdom is protection.